On Christmas Eve, my family asked me to step out of our annual photo, but only after they looked at my daughter. What they did next made me walk away from them forever. I always believed that family meant unconditional love and acceptance, that blood ties created bonds nothing could break. But on Christmas Eve last year, as my entire extended family gathered for our annual holiday photo, my grandmother asked me to step out of the frame and take my daughter with me. That moment, captured not in the photograph but burned into my memory forever, showed me exactly where I stood in my family's eyes and forced me to make the hardest decision of my life about who deserved to be part of our future. My name is Rachel, and I'm 28 years old. I grew up in what most people would consider a traditional, close-knit family. My parents Michael and Susan raised me and my two younger siblings, my brother Jason and sister Emily, in a suburban home where Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings were sacred traditions. My father's mother, my grandmother Margaret, was the matriarch of the family, and her opinions and preferences shaped everything from what we ate to how we celebrated to who was considered acceptable. I always knew I was different from my siblings, though I couldn't quite articulate how when I was younger. Jason was the athletic son, the one who played football and made my father proud by being traditionally masculine. Emily was the perfect daughter, pretty and sweet and eager to please, exactly what my grandmother wanted in a granddaughter. I was somewhere in between, tomboyish and independent, more interested in books and art than sports or makeup, never quite fitting the mold my family seemed to have prepared for me. When I was 19 and in college, I fell in love with a woman named Alexis. It wasn't something I'd expected or planned, and it challenged everything I thought I knew about myself and my future. But the connection was undeniable, and after months of confusion and self-reflection, I accepted that I was bisexual and that my feelings for Alexis were real and valid. Coming out to my family was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, especially knowing how traditional and religious they were. My parents' reaction was about what I'd expected: shock, denial, disappointment, and eventual cold acceptance. They said they loved me but couldn't support my lifestyle choice, as they called it. They hoped I'd eventually grow out of this phase and find a nice man to settle down with. My siblings were awkward and distant, not hostile exactly but clearly uncomfortable. My grandmother's reaction was the worst. She told me I was sinning, that I was bringing shame on the family, that she was ashamed to call me her granddaughter. Despite their reactions, I continued to live my truth. Alexis and I dated for 2 years through college, and my family refused to meet her or acknowledge our relationship. When we eventually broke up for reasons unrelated to my family's disapproval, I think my parents secretly hoped I'd move on to dating men and they could pretend my relationship with Alexis had never happened. But I didn't move on to dating men exclusively. I dated both men and women over the next few years, and each time I brought a female partner around, my family would be cold and unwelcoming. Male partners were treated civilly if not warmly, while female partners were ignored or treated with barely concealed contempt. It became easier to just not bring anyone to family gatherings, to keep my romantic life completely separate from my family life. When I was 25, I met Marcus. He was kind, intelligent, funny, and we connected deeply. He was also black, which I knew would be another issue for my family even though no one had ever explicitly stated they were racist. But there were always comments about neighborhoods or crime statistics or cultural differences that revealed underlying prejudices. I dreaded introducing Marcus to my family, knowing they'd find something to criticize even if they tried to hide it behind politeness. My instincts were right. When I brought Marcus to a family dinner, my grandmother was cold to the point of rudeness. She barely spoke to him, didn't ask him any questions about his life or career, and made a pointed comment about how she'd always imagined I'd end up with someone more like us. My parents were more polite but clearly uncomfortable. My siblings were friendly enough, but later my brother made a joke about me having a type that was always complicated, implying that both my sexuality and my choice of a black partner were problems. Marcus noticed the treatment but was gracious about it, saying he'd experienced racism before and my family wasn't the first or the worst. But I could see the hurt in his eyes, and I felt ashamed of my family's behavior. I started seeing them less frequently, making excuses to skip gatherings, trying to protect Marcus from their prejudice while also avoiding confrontation about their attitudes. Despite my family's disapproval, Marcus and I built a life together. We moved in together, got engaged, and started planning a future. My family's reaction to our engagement was lukewarm at best. My mother cried and said she'd always dreamed of planning my wedding to someone different. My grandmother refused to come to the wedding if we went through with it, saying she couldn't in good conscience celebrate a union she didn't approve of. The fact that I was marrying a man should have been enough for her given her previous objections to my sexuality, but apparently Marcus being black negated any approval she might have had for the heterosexual aspect of our relationship. Marcus and I got married in a small ceremony with friends and a few supportive relatives. My parents came but looked miserable the entire time. My siblings came but left early. My grandmother kept her word and didn't attend, sending a card with a Bible verse about unequal yoking that made it clear she viewed our marriage as a mistake. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life, but it was tinged with sadness about my family's rejection. About a year after our wedding, I got pregnant. Marcus and I were thrilled, excited to start our family and begin this new chapter. When I told my parents I was expecting, their reaction was complicated. They were happy about becoming grandparents, but I could tell they had mixed feelings about the baby being biracial. My mother made comments about hoping the baby would be light-skinned or have my features rather than Marcus's. My grandmother said nothing at all when I told her the news, just pursed her lips and changed the subject. When our daughter Zoe was born, she was absolutely perfect. She had Marcus's beautiful dark skin and curly hair, and my eyes and smile. She was healthy and happy and the love of our lives. When my parents came to the hospital to meet her, I watched their faces carefully. They held her and said the appropriate things about how beautiful she was, but there was something missing, some warmth or genuine joy that I'd expected to see from new grandparents meeting their first grandchild. My grandmother didn't come to the hospital at all. She waited weeks before asking to see Zoe, and when she finally did visit our home, she held the baby stiffly and briefly before handing her back. She made a comment about Zoe's hair being difficult to manage and asked if I was planning to do anything about it, as if my daughter's natural black hair was a problem that needed fixing. Marcus was furious but stayed calm, and I asked my grandmother to leave shortly after. Over the next 2 years as Zoe grew, the pattern of different treatment became more obvious and more painful. My brother Jason had gotten married to a white woman named Ashley, and they had a son named Cooper who was 6 months younger than Zoe. The favoritism was blatant. Cooper got elaborate gifts while Zoe got generic toys. My parents babysit Cooper regularly but had watched Zoe maybe 3 times total. My grandmother displayed dozens of photos of Cooper in her home but not a single picture of Zoe. I tried to talk to my parents about the different treatment, but they denied it or made excuses. They said Jason lived closer so it was easier to watch Cooper, even though the distance was negligible. They said they bought different gifts because Cooper was a boy and Zoe was a girl, ignoring the obvious disparity in expense and thoughtfulness. They couldn't or wouldn't admit that their treatment of my daughter was different because of her race. Emily, my younger sister, had also gotten married to a white man and had twin daughters just a few months before this past Christmas. My parents were over the moon, constantly visiting, helping out, buying gifts, posting photos on social media. It was everything they hadn't been for Zoe, and the contrast was stark and painful. Zoe was old enough now at 2.5 to notice that Grandma and Grandpa acted differently with Cooper and with the twins than they did with her. She'd ask why Grandma didn't play with her the same way, and I didn't know how to explain racism and prejudice to a toddler. Despite everything, I kept showing up to family gatherings. I kept hoping things would change, that my family would eventually see Zoe for the amazing child she was, that they'd overcome their prejudices and embrace their granddaughter and niece. I told myself I was giving Zoe a connection to extended family even if it wasn't perfect, that having some relationship with grandparents and cousins was better than none. This past Christmas Eve, my family gathered at my parents' house for our traditional holiday celebration. It was the whole extended family, my parents, my grandmother, Jason and Ashley with Cooper, Emily and her husband Ben with their twins Madison and Mackenzie, and Marcus, Zoe, and me. It should have been a joyful gathering, all the cousins together, multiple generations celebrating the holiday. But from the moment we arrived, I felt the familiar tension. Cooper was allowed to run around freely while Zoe was constantly corrected or redirected. The twins were cooed over constantly while Zoe was largely ignored unless she did something my family deemed inappropriate. Marcus and I were civil with everyone, playing along with the illusion that everything was fine, while I watched my daughter being treated as less than and felt my heart breaking. After dinner, my father announced it was time for the annual family Christmas photo. This was a tradition going back decades, a formal portrait of the entire family that my grandmother treasured. Every year, she'd have the photo framed and would give copies to all her children and grandchildren. It was supposed to be a representation of family unity and love, a keepsake to mark another year together. Everyone gathered in the living room where my father had set up his camera on a tripod. He was arranging people, directing where everyone should stand or sit, trying to compose the perfect shot. My grandmother was to be seated in the center as the matriarch, with my parents standing behind her. Jason's family was positioned on one side, Emily's on the other. Marcus, Zoe, and I stood near Emily, and I was holding Zoe in my arms since she was getting tired and fussy. My father was looking through the camera viewfinder, making adjustments, when my grandmother spoke up. She said the photo didn't look quite right, that something was off about the composition. My father asked what she wanted changed, and my grandmother paused for a moment before saying that maybe the photo should just be blood family this year, that including spouses made it too crowded. Marcus immediately understood what was happening and his face hardened. He started to step out of the frame, but my grandmother stopped him. She said no, he could stay, but that maybe I should step out and take Zoe with me since she was fussy anyway. The room went silent. Everyone understood what was really being said. Marcus could stay in the photo because he was an adult who'd married into the family, but Zoe and I should leave because Zoe was the visible evidence of our interracial marriage. I felt like I'd been slapped. My grandmother was asking me, her granddaughter, to remove myself and my child from the family photo. Not because the photo was too crowded, since she'd specifically said Marcus could stay. Not because Zoe was fussy, since Cooper was actually being much more disruptive. But because my grandmother didn't want my biracial daughter in the family portrait that would hang on her wall and represent her legacy. No one said anything. My parents stood there silently, not objecting to my grandmother's request. Jason and Emily looked uncomfortable but didn't speak up. Ashley and Ben stared at the floor. It was clear that while they might not all agree with my grandmother's blatant racism, no one was willing to challenge her or stand up for Zoe and me. Marcus started to say something, his voice tight with anger, but I stopped him. I looked at my grandmother and asked her directly if she was asking me to step out of the family photo because of Zoe. My grandmother didn't deny it. She said that the photo was meant to represent the family as she wanted to remember it, and that I would understand someday when I was older. She actually said that, as if there was some wisdom in excluding your great-granddaughter from a family photo because of her skin color. I looked around the room at my family, giving them a chance to object, to tell my grandmother this was wrong, to stand up for me and my daughter. My mother looked like she might cry but said nothing. My father was suddenly very interested in his camera settings. Jason shook his head slightly but stayed silent. Emily wouldn't meet my eyes. Not one person in that room was willing to tell my grandmother that what she was doing was unacceptable. I walked out of the frame, still holding Zoe. I walked past all of them, grabbed our coats from the closet, and told Marcus we were leaving. My grandmother called after me saying I was being dramatic, that I was ruining Christmas over nothing. My mother tried to stop us, saying we should just take the photo and talk about this later. But there was nothing to talk about. My family had shown me exactly where Zoe and I stood in their eyes. Marcus was shaking with anger as we drove home. He said he'd known my family had issues but he'd never imagined they'd be so blatant about it. He said we should have cut them off years ago, that we never should have subjected Zoe to their prejudice. He was right, and I felt enormous guilt for exposing my daughter to people who viewed her as less than because of her race. Zoe asked from her car seat why we left, why we didn't take the picture with everyone else. I tried to explain in age-appropriate terms that sometimes people make choices that hurt other people, and that Grandma had made a choice that hurt Mommy and Daddy's feelings. Zoe asked if Grandma didn't like her, and I couldn't lie. I said that Grandma had some wrong ideas about people, but that it wasn't Zoe's fault and that she was perfect exactly as she was. When we got home, Marcus and I had a long conversation about what to do next. He said the decision was ultimately mine since they were my family, but that he wouldn't allow Zoe to be around them anymore if they were going to treat her this way. I agreed completely. We decided to cut off contact with my entire family until they could acknowledge what they'd done was wrong and commit to treating Zoe equally to her cousins. My phone exploded with messages later that evening. My mother sent long texts saying I'd overreacted, that my grandmother was from a different generation and I should make allowances for her age and upbringing. She said walking out had embarrassed everyone and ruined Christmas Eve. Jason sent a message saying I was being too sensitive, that it was just a photo and not worth destroying the family over. Emily called crying, saying she understood why I was upset but begging me not to create more drama. Not one person apologized for what had happened. Not one person acknowledged that asking me to remove my daughter from a family photo because of her race was racist and cruel. They were all more concerned about my reaction to the discrimination than about the discrimination itself. It was a perfect encapsulation of how they'd always responded to issues involving Zoe: denial, deflection, and blaming me for making things uncomfortable by calling out their behavior. The only message that mattered came from my grandmother herself, texted from my mother's phone the next day. It said that she'd thought about it and realized she'd hurt my feelings, and that she hoped I could forgive her and we could move past this. But there was no real apology, no acknowledgement of what she'd actually done or why it was wrong. Just a vague statement about hurt feelings, as if this was about me being oversensitive rather than about her being racist toward her own great-granddaughter. I didn't respond to any of them. Marcus and I spent Christmas Day just the three of us, making it special for Zoe in every way we could. We watched movies, made cookies, opened presents, and talked about how families are about love and respect, not about who looks like who or follows what traditions. Zoe had a wonderful Christmas, completely unaware that the night before, her extended family had tried to erase her from their history. In the weeks after Christmas, various family members continued reaching out trying to smooth things over. My mother wanted us to come to Sunday dinner like nothing had happened. Jason invited us to Cooper's birthday party. Emily sent photos of the twins and asked when we could get the cousins together. They all wanted to return to normal without ever addressing what normal had been, a dynamic where my daughter was treated as less than because of her race. I finally sent a group message to my parents and siblings laying out exactly why we wouldn't be attending family events anymore. I detailed years of different treatment, the favoritism toward Cooper and the twins, the lack of interest in Zoe's life and milestones. I explained that asking me to step out of a family photo with my biracial daughter was the culmination of years of racism they'd all participated in or enabled through their silence. I said we'd be open to rebuilding relationships if they could acknowledge their behavior, apologize sincerely, and commit to treating Zoe with the same love and respect they showed her cousins. Until then, we needed to protect our daughter from people who saw her as less than. The responses varied. My mother said I was being cruel and punishing the whole family for my grandmother's mistake. Jason accused me of playing the race card and being divisive. Emily said she'd always been nice to Zoe and didn't deserve to be lumped in with everyone else. My father said nothing at all. My grandmother sent another non-apology saying she was sorry I felt excluded but that she'd just been trying to arrange a nice photo. Not one of them could bring themselves to actually acknowledge the racism, to admit that they'd treated Zoe differently because she was biracial, to take real accountability for years of microaggressions and overt prejudice. They wanted to maintain the relationship on their terms, with me continuing to bring Zoe around to be tolerated at best and excluded at worst, while I stayed silent about their treatment of her. It's been almost a year now since that Christmas Eve. We haven't had any contact with my family in all that time. Zoe asks about them occasionally, but less and less as time goes on. We've built a chosen family of friends and Marcus's relatives who celebrate Zoe for exactly who she is, who don't see her race as something to overcome or ignore but as part of her beautiful identity. Through the grapevine, I've heard that my family took another Christmas photo this year without us in it. I wonder if my grandmother hung it on her wall with pride, satisfied that it represented the family the way she wanted to remember it: white, traditional, acceptable. I wonder if any of them ever think about the granddaughter and great-granddaughter they pushed away, or if they've convinced themselves I was the problem for not accepting their prejudice quietly. Sometimes I grieve for what could have been, for the grandmother relationship Zoe deserved, for the sibling relationships I'd hoped to maintain, for the extended family celebrations that might have enriched her childhood. But mostly I feel relief and peace. Zoe is growing up knowing she's loved and valued for exactly who she is. She's not learning to accept being treated as less than. She's not internalizing the message that her race makes her unworthy of full inclusion in her own family. On Christmas Eve, my family took a group photo and asked me to step out with my child. They thought they were preserving their image of what family should look like, maintaining a photograph that matched their narrow worldview. What they actually did was show me that they'd never seen Zoe or me as truly belonging, that their love was conditional on us fitting their expectations and not challenging their prejudices. That photograph hangs on my grandmother's wall now, I'm told, a picture of a family that only exists in their selective memory. Meanwhile, I have photographs of my real family, Marcus, Zoe, and the people who chose to love us completely and unconditionally. We're building traditions of our own, creating memories of holidays filled with genuine love and acceptance rather than tolerance and exclusion. And when Zoe grows up and asks about her maternal grandparents and why we don't see them, I'll be able to tell her honestly that I chose her over people who couldn't see her worth, that I picked her dignity over their comfort, that she was always enough just as she was. And I'll know I made the right choice, even if it was the hardest one I ever had to make.